Good morning, and thank you for joining us. I'm Kate McDonald, Director of Israel and Jewish Advocacy at the Baltimore Jewish Council, and on behalf of the BJC's Israel Committee, I'd like to welcome you to this webinar on the World Zionist Congress elections taking place now. Shortly, I'm going to post a link in the chat on how to register and learn more about these important elections. We're delighted to be joined by Rabbi Andrew Busch and Dr. Neil Rubin, who will help us understand why these elections are so significant, how they started, what they mean, and why your vote matters. They really need no introduction, but in a minute, I'm going to read their bios anyway, as a reminder of how fortunate we are to have their leadership and their wisdom here in Baltimore. Each of them is going to speak briefly, and then BJC Executive Director Howard Libet and I will open it up for conversation, including audience questions. So please do use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to submit any questions you may have for Neil and Rabbi Busch. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers for today. Rabbi Andrew Busch has served as the Senior Rabbi of Baltimore Hebrew Congregation since 2008. Previously, he served congregations in New Orleans, suburban Philadelphia, and Pittsburgh. He is a past president of the Baltimore Jewish Council and has served on the national boards of the Central Conference of American Rabbis and the Joint Reform Commission on Worship and Religious Living. Rabbi Busch received a BA from Brandeis University and studied at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He was ordained at the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. Dr. Neil Rubin chairs the Department of Jewish History at Beth Tefillah High School. At Towson University's Baltimore Hebrew Institute, he taught Zion, the history of modern Zionism. At UMBC and the Baltimore Hebrew University, he taught American Jewish history. He recently completed a 3-part lecture series to future priests at St. Mary's Seminary on the history and legacy of the Holocaust. And for 2 summers, he was the American educator for the Elijah Cummings Youth Program month-long Israel trip. Dr. Rubin's main areas of interest are Israel diaspora Jewish ties, late 19th and early 20th century Jewish ideologies, the evolving nature of American Jewish identity, and the continuing transformation of the Baltimore Orioles. In early 2026, his chapter on American Jews since October 7th, 2023, will be published in an upcoming book edited by Dr. Robert O. Friedman. Thank you both so much for being here. And Neil, we're going to start with you this morning. Could you share some of the history of the World Zionist Congress elections?
Sure, thanks, Kate. And as Kate said, my job right now is for a few minutes to share with you the history, the really storied history of the World Zionist Congress, how it's changed. And I know that Rabbi Busch and I will in a bit get into how it's different this year in many regards. The history of the World Zionist Congress, of course, is an offshoot of the World Zionist Organization, which Theodor Herzl formed. This is an offshoot itself of his book that came out in the late 19th century called Der Judenstaat. It came out in German, by the way, because for Herzl and much of the Central European Jewish world that drove these early years, German was the language, as we know, of sophistication. And Herzl, in his book, even saw German as the language for the Jewish state in the land of Israel. His conference the next year brought together, hundreds of people, not all of them who will be voting delegates, and that's something that continues to happen today. And right from the start, we saw this tension between what we'll call the Herzlian political Zionists and the Achad Amis, the cultural Zionists. But they did pass the Basel platform. It was in Basel, Switzerland. And really the key sentence there is Zionism seeks for the Jewish people a publicly recognized, legally secured homeland in Palestine. Different visions of how to go about it, but that was the agreed upon goal. Interestingly enough, the only voting American delegate came from Baltimore. And interestingly enough, he was an Orthodox rabbi. I say that because many of us know that, at least formally, the Orthodox and Reform movements were really against Zionism in the beginning. The conservative movement doesn't really rise in America until the first decade or so of the 20th century. You have a little bit of information. Yeah?
I'm so sorry to interrupt. Did you want to show your slides?
I thought I had been projecting them, and I apologize. Let me take care of that right now. Shows you what I know, right? I'm showing these people these slides, and I'm sure you guys have imagined it all, and I don't have to go back at all.
You did
So
a beautiful job describing
my
what's on them.
apologies on that. All right, I had been going through those slides, which you definitely picked up, and hopefully now you were beginning to see them. Okay, so we have Rabbi Shepsel Schaffer here. He is from Baltimore. He's not originally from Baltimore, but he's the only American voting delegate to the World Zionist Congress. He formed really a chapter here of Chovet Zion, which is something that Chad Ha'am would have started in the 1880s, actually in Russia then, really in the Ukraine, what we call Ukraine today. Baltimore has always been a hotbed of Zionist leadership. Interestingly enough, we have the Orthodox rabbi in them about a decade or so. Going to have the Friedenwald family. Dr. Harry Friedenwald has become a national leader and an international leader in the socialist Zionist. In these early congresses, we had really the legends of the Zionist movement. Most of these people, some of you may or may not know Israel Zangwill. He's going to get irritated after the 1904 Zionist Congress turns down the idea of a temporary Jewish state, what Max Nordau called a Nachtstal, or a night stop for the Zionist movement in Uganda. That's the famous Uganda plan, actually in eastern Kenya. He's going to form something called the Territorialists, which means we just have to get Jews out of Europe now, no matter where they are. And we're going to do everything, including bring 9,500 of them into the United States through the bustling port of Galveston, Texas. And there still are some Jews in the Deep South, as we call it, who are descendants of those people today.
Neil, if I can interrupt there, since you went there, the current rabbi of the Reformed congregation in Galveston began his career as a rabbi in Baltimore. So
okay.
There's your connection.
There's a lot of connections for us. This is from the most recent World Zionist Congress, by the way. Since 1951, they've all been held in Jerusalem, which makes total sense. You'll notice there are gaps when there are world wars. The most tragic one, of course, was the 1939 conference. They generally took place in August, early August. We know that the war started midnight at the end of August, September 1st, and everybody knew war was coming, and there are emotional scenes in diaries of people hugging each other, wondering if they will ever see each other again. They remember the devastation from World War I, but of course, they could not envision what it meant for World War II. So why am I sharing this type of detail? It's because it lets you know that really we can see what's happening with the Jewish people in some regards through the World Zionist Congresses, because while it started out as a minority movement, by then it had become a majority movement in the Jewish world. There were a number of historical significant events. I'm going to, of course, go quickly through them, and I'm purposely leaving a lot of time for question and answers, as well as Rabbi Busch's comments. We saw the socialist Zionists appear very early on. Remember, 1897 is only the first one. That's important because they are actually going to be the people ultimately who create the structure of the state. The JNF was established early on as well. It was not established to plant trees. It was established to buy land. Indeed, they would wind up buying some land in what we now call the Gaza Strip, southern Lebanon, and western Jordan as well. And their other principal goal at that Congress was to create Hebrew culture. Remember, early Zionism was not a rescue and relief program in many regards to the early founders, or at least those who went to Israel, as much as it was an opportunity to create a new Jew. And thus things became known as Hebrew around the world. We talked about Uganda. 1913, there's a vote to create a Hebrew university. In 1925, 100 years ago, I think a week and a half ago, it finally opened with all the luminaries being present. In 1951, it opened dramatically at Herzl's grave. Remember, Herzl had willed it in his last testament that his body would be brought to the state of Israel when it was created. And at that same convention, they had realized that they had accomplished the Basel program. So they had to create a new program, which still drives it today, which is the Jerusalem program. And I always love the wording of these historical documents. Clearly, they're committee decisions. The consolidation of the state of Israel, the ingathering of the exiles in Eretz Israel, and the fostering of the unity of the Jewish people. It's a fair question to ask if that's ever happened in history or if we can do it now. The movement itself has changed as well as stayed the same. You see some really neat historical artifacts here. You pay the historical Zionist shekel, you see in that top right, to be able to vote. Today in America, we pay $5. It's symbolic. I always like the kind of literary, historical, religious link to the shekel or the half shekel in the Torah. Zionism, as we said before, was a minority movement. Reform Jews and classical reform of the beginning of the Zionist movement believed that the job was to spread prophetic Judaism, and to do that, the values of the Jewish prophets, you had to be not only all over the world, but in a strong, meaningful Jewish community influencing the broader society. Reform, of course, was waiting for Mashiach, a Messiah. You can, as the Talmud tells you in Ketuvot, force the end. But clearly, as Europe became worse and worse and worse for the Jewish people, there was an obvious need for a place of rescue and relief. And that really changes the whole Zionist program. And indeed, today, I'd say that that is but an echo, and where even though we have obvious problems today, we as a people are trying to figure out what our Jewish state wants to be, or we want it to be when it grows up, which is very different than, in some regards, people in Israel itself. We, of course, so that's pretty clear. By the way, that's a Jewish New Year card from Max Nordau to other Zionist delegates at the bottom there. I would just absolutely love to have that artifact myself, or make a print of it. So what hasn't changed? This is a big deal. I can just wow you with the number of $1 billion, but it truly is representative, not on a percentage basis, but in that all Jews everywhere can vote. And how the elections turn out is how the elections turn out. This will decide the policies of the World Zionist Organization, and to an extent, what was the Jewish Agency for Palestine and now Israel. There are still about 500 elected delegates. You'll notice the disproportionate amount that goes to Israel and the United States. For all intent purposes, we really are two poles in the Jewish world today. And it's an interesting question as to whether or not those numbers should change. I wanted to mention that on the questions that remain. We really do have a Jewish world today that is driven by American political philanthropic efforts and the Israeli government rightly making decisions in its own land. The role of what we Jews in the diaspora should play in those decisions is a fascinating one. I've always felt, for example, that the diaspora should have a member of the Knesset who can only vote on matters involving the diaspora, but that's perhaps up for discussion as well. The demographic changes are going to be clear. Many of us remember around the world Jewish communities that were once significantly larger than they are today, or perhaps even gone. There's a big issue of how to get more voters. In some elections, we've seen an increase in the last election. The one before that had dropped. It's a good election if 100,000 vote. I think because of what's going on in Israel today, and because of social media, and because of just the way word spreads about things today, we could be seeing a historic turnout this year. And finally, there's a major split that we need to consider that we might get to. The World Zionist Organization helps fund the Jewish Agency, helps direct the Jewish Agency for Israel. Should it? Should that just be the province of the government of the state of Israel? Should we really get involved in that? Should we just spread the Zionist agenda, or at least Ahavat Yisrael, the love of Israel, in the diaspora communities, which, unlike the hopes of the early Zionists, will not be going away, because, as I like to teach my students, I know that all the Jews aren't going to Israel. I know that because we're here having this conversation in English. With that alone, I'm going to leave it to Rabbi Busch.
Thank you so much, Neil. I'm sure that we are going to return to some of those questions that you left us with at the end. I hope we'll have time to discuss some of that. Rabbi Busch, you are actually running on one of the slates, and I want to be very clear that our conversation today is nonpartisan, so we won't be discussing the details of that particular slate. But can you share some of your thoughts on this year's election? Why is it important, and what does it mean to be on a slate?
Absolutely. Happy to talk about it. Agreed from the start to talk about it. I'm not here electioneering for any one slate, though with your permission, Kate, I think my honesty about that bears admitting which slate I'm on. I'm just not pushing a slate. Also, just to be clear, I do not have beautiful slides like Neil did. So they're not missing if you're looking for them. A couple different things, right? These are, in my reality, happening every 5 years. I mean, Neil gave us the history on this. I cannot claim before I was ordained as a rabbi, I was aware of the World Zionist Organization elections. But I can say that every 5 years for my whole career, I have been encouraging people to participate in the elections. And I was ordained as a rabbi in 1994. So it's been several rounds. And to be clear, this is the first time that I am serving on a slate, yet I've encouraged this all the way along. So it's not about my being on the slate, nor did I ask to be put on a slate, right? I was approached about being a slate. I'm not electioneering in that way in terms of it, right? Why I'm on a slate, why I've encouraged this my whole career, has to do with so much of what Neil just talked about. It has to do with both supporting a Zionist vision and supporting Jewish homeland and governance in Israel and supporting the state of Israel. And it has to do with caring about relations between Israel and the diaspora, right? And the numbers about that make that America and Israel, but in so many ways we have are aware, are often nervous about what this means for other Jewish communities and their relationships in terms of that, right? A number of pieces that float to that and are related to that. Again, I said I care about this in so many different ways. Why I'm on a slate simply magnifies that, right? I care about Israel. I care about the Israel diaspora relationship. I do that as an individual. I do that as a rabbi. I have never been an adult without being a rabbi, or I guess I was for several years. So I'm actually not clear what the distinction is between my being an individual Jew and a rabbi, but they care the same, right? They relate to the same issues in terms of this, right? If I'm going to care about what's going on in Israel, and if I'm going to care about what happens in Israel, and if I'm going to care about the relationship between American Jewry, world Jewry, and Israel, then this is one of the most concrete ways I can show that. I can live and study in Israel as I have long-term for 3 years, for 3 different times, and lead trips to Israel and go on trips to Israel in better times, twice since the current war was going on, in terms of that. But this is a really concrete way to voice our experience and our curiosity and our connection. And as Neil said, in a good year, in a Jewish community in America of millions of Jews, we get 100,000, whatever it is, 200,000 votes, whatever it is. I think you increase that number, and it says to our own communities, it potentially says to other Americans, though I don't think there are a lot of Americans who aren't Jewish paying attention to this, and it says to Israel that we care, right? And when I'm challenged as a congregational rabbi who talks about this from the Bima, who am I to speak anything about what happens in Israel? Well, the reality is only American Jews can vote in this round of elections. So therefore, the very structure, not only from the 19th century to 1948, that exists, that allowed the world to vote on this, but from 1951 on, when that first conference happens in Israel, first convention happens in Israel, we are only the ones who can vote on this. right? It would make no sense for American Jews not to participate in voting in this election if we're the only ones who can vote in terms of that. It's a crucial piece within this. All you need to do is look at the list of 22 slates that are on the link that Kate put in chat that you can get to. All you need to do is look at the 22 slates to understand that just about everyone who chooses to connect to Israel within the American Jewish community can find themselves represented somewhere in these 22 slates. If you're looking at the list and you see 23 slates, it's because for some American superstitious reason, 13 is marked as intentionally left blank. That is not the name of a slate. That is intentionally left blank. But we look at the range of slates, and whoever we are within the Baltimore community, we can find a voice here. I would say even more so than in the past. You've got some slates here that might even question in terms of what Israel looks like, right? Some slates that historically were, let's just say, not enthusiastic about Zionism without putting anything sharper on it. Reform Judaism included, but some other branches of Judaism as well that were less excited, that are fully engaged. Some of them have been for decades, some of them really only for the last round or two. And it really gives us a chance. It gives us a chance in terms of influencing seats on the leadership of what are called the national institutions. Neil listed the two major ones. The new Jewish National Fund of Israel is also one of the things represented here, different than the Jewish National Fund of America, of the United States. It influences who's in positions of authority, who's sitting in the ruling structures of these institutions, how $1 billion gets allocated. $1 billion is a fractional amount of the Israeli national budget. But if my quick Googling yesterday worked, it's not a ridiculously fractional number. I picked up somewhere about 135 billion, I think was the last year's Israel's national government budget. So we've got a voice in terms of how that happens. As should be obvious if you're looking at the slate, though there are other slates that I find appealing. I am on the vote reform slate. I am on the slate of the Reform Jewish community. In terms of that, you do not have to be a Reform Jew to vote for that slate, right? In terms of what that means. But I'm there because that represents a vision of what I'd like to see happen in Israel and be influenced. And I totally embrace and accept and would encourage everyone to vote for the slate somewhere in there that most actively matches what they encourage. Two last pieces, and then I'll open it up to questions. One, as you look at the slate, I'm sure we've got plenty of proud Hadassah members on this call, right? You don't see Hadassah. And one of the questions I get asked most often is, well, I'm not going to vote for slate X because I'm a member of Hadassah. Hadassah has its own set aside of seats. I was surprised as late as it was. 1994 is when that set aside happened, but it's got its own set aside of slates, which is why seats why you don't see it here. Neil, I'm not sure if any other institution has such a set aside.
Yeah, a lot of major organizations do, and that too is something that needs to be looked at. For example, B'nai B'rith, I think ZOA might have its own set aside too, but I can't remember, to be honest.
Well, they went in a coalition, so I think they don't. The coalition of
Okay.
515.
Yeah, but it started as, it's kind of like some of the political parties do. There's a certain amount of set aside delegates for various groups or people.
So I think that fits, but it's the question of worth knowing, right? If you're a member of a Zionist organization and it's not pushed, if you look at Hadassah's material, they're currently just encouraging people to vote. If they felt like they needed your votes, they'd be encouraging you to vote for their slate member, right? So in terms of that, the other thing I want to talk about is Neil talked about Reform Judaism not being historically Zionist in terms of that, and that's something that comes very much home.
By the way, Robert, I want to interrupt you and tell you that, of course, as you know well, Rabbi Stephen S. Wise, the Reform rabbi, was an early leader, as was Rabbi Judah Magnus,
yes,
but they didn't represent the mainstream.
Right. No, I'm going there. But what I would say is from the beginning of Reform Judaism, there were Reform Jews and Reform rabbis who were Zionist, right? There were Reform Jews and Reform rabbis who were Zionist, but maybe not in a let's build a state mode, right? Maybe more in an Echad Ha'am mode. All of that happens from the beginning of Reform Judaism, or the beginning of Zionism within a Reform Jewish model. So by the end of the 19th century, in terms of that, 1937 is the year that the movement becomes officially Zionist with the Columbus platform of the Central Conference of American Rabbis, but it's happening before that, right? And Judah Magnus is the one that, Rabbi Judah Magnus is the one that connects to what Neil just said, as in Judah Magnus was the first chancellor, then president of the Hebrew University, actually, in terms of his role, a Reform rabbi, highly identified with the Reform movement. By the time I'm getting ready for my bar mitzvah, even a few years before that, every Reform rabbi that you meet in the United States is spending a year of the rabbinical school at the Hebrew Union College campus in Jerusalem, right? But the movement had become Zionist long before that. That's just sort of the clearest demarcation of the importance of it within the movement. I'm going to leave it there, and Neil and I are happy to take the questions from Howard and Kate, and however this runs.
Great. Well, we actually have a lot of questions from the audience that kind of overlap with some of the questions that Howard and I had pulled together. And I thought that we could start with one from Joey Fink, asking about the process of voting. I think that would be helpful for our audience to hear more about. So can you provide some clarity around voting? There are various individuals running on various slates. As a Baltimore resident, do I simply vote for a slate and that dictates the individual I'm voting for? If I know which slate I want to vote for, am I deciding between candidates in a slate from all over the USA? Can you talk about strategy of voting? I mean, I know some of the slates have, huge numbers of people on them. So how does that work?
So I'm going to do, I think for a lot of these questions, potentially, I'm the color and Neil's the play-by-play, I think. But I will feel free to do play-by-play and Neil can do color. So what I would say, and then I'll toss it to Neil, though I've been answering this question also, right, is the way I describe this process is downright Byzantine, right? This is a very confusing process, especially for those of us whose primary voting awareness is the United States.
Yes.
But if we think about how voting happens in Israel and in some other places, and how it happened historically, in democracies in different ways, there are different ways that happens, right? And so it's confusing because Americans don't usually vote for slates. We vote for individuals, but in Israel, they vote for slates. And the great way to figure that one out is the Israeli delegation to the World Zionist Congress is determined by the results of the last Knesset election, right? Which shows you that we're sort of mimicking the model that they're running by, which Neil, I assume on both levels, mimics what was probably happening in the Zionist Congresses before the state, I imagine.
Absolutely. You have to remember that Herzl and his buddies were, and it was all men, at least in the very beginning, they were very much enamored by the European parliamentary style of government. And that's what they saw as part of their job, was to bring a Westernization, sophisticated governance to the Jewish people in the land of Israel. And it really hasn't changed. And sometimes it's a beautiful thing, and sometimes it's like making sausage.
And what I would say there, so you vote for a slate, right? The number one on the list is Shas. The last one's Cherut North America, right? The slates were determined by random selection, which says it right there, right? If you wonder about this, and you cannot vote for an individual. This is not like the one time in the Knesset elections that they voted for the prime minister separate than the rest of the slate. This runs very similar in terms of slates and who's there. Some of these slates are sole standing, like Merkaz USA is the conservative movement's slate. Some of them are combinations of different groups. For example, the ZOA coalition says it represents 30 organizations that came together in a slate, and some are not necessarily directly tied to any slate, to any other organizations entirely, but rather are a group of people that came together and formed an organization to run for for this.
Yeah, it's
And the list
coalition
has never
politics
been
at
the
its
same
finest.
between the two elections. It's never been the same from one to the other.
So to clarify, like depending on where you are on the list and then how many votes your slate gets depends on how deep they go into the list in terms of whether a person gets elected if they're on the slate. Is that right?
Yeah,
Correct.
it's just like for
Okay,
example,
just like the
the British
Israeli.
Parliament, the same thing.
Yep. Okay.
Correct. I'm about 40% into my slate as I sort of just judge it, right? It is quite large, right? Like the Knesset, theoretically, every party is running with 120
Yeah,
people.
they do,
No
and they
party
have
has
some
ever gotten
honorary things for at the end.
right. No party's ever gotten a majority. That's how it's run. But not everyone who gets elected will necessarily end up being able to be at the World Zionist Congress. So it may move down in different ways.
May do alternates. And do you, with the Knesset elections, there's a minimum threshold for a party to get any representation in the Knesset. Is there a similar requirement of a minimum threshold for a slate to get any representation?
There is, but it depends on the number of votes, I believe, of overall votes. They can't really decide yet.
No, but is there a threshold like the 3.25% for the current to get into the Howard? That you should be executive director of the Baltimore Jewish Council. I have not been asked that question. That is, there must be. And I assume, like in the Knesset elections, there may be some lists that don't make the threshold and don't. I've never paid attention to that actually.
There are a number of that don't get it cut in. And really, I think part of it is in the overall number of votes and how they're going to divide it. It'll shift a little each time. And their rules are very, as we said earlier, as Rabbi Busch says, very Byzantine.
The one thing I will add, since we're talking Knesset and it's worth knowing, if you are Israeli and voted in the last Knesset election, you cannot vote in this election. In other words, we have people in the community that are both Israeli citizens and American citizens. You are not allowed to. In fairness, everyone should follow the rules. So I'm not encouraging anyone to be dishonest. I don't think there's actually any mechanism to double check it. I think it's an honor system. But technically, if you voted the last time in the Knesset election, which for most Israelis who live overseas, they need to go back to Israel. There's some small exceptions to that. If you voted 2 times ago, but didn't vote last time, and you're an American Jew, you can vote in these elections, right? But if you're a dual citizen, you can't vote in both elections in the same round.
And then so the Israeli portion of the Congress is decided by the Knesset election, and the American portion is decided from this election. And then I think Neil's slide talked about another chunk of members of the Congress are decided from the diaspora outside of the United States. Is there a separate election that happens worldwide for that?
Yeah, they'll have their own. And again, remember that some major organizations do as well, and that could count as part of that.
And those slates are not necessarily the same as the American slates or the Israeli Knesset-based parties.
Right. But I just want to drive home the point that as crazy as all that sounds, we're here just to encourage you to vote.
Absolutely.
Just
absolutely.
Vote. You can vote. Please vote.
Right. No, I think that is the goal, I think, to have this program. Vote for one of these slates. What I would say, Howard, is different, right? Some of that is like organizational, like Hadassah or whatever, but some of it is, right, French Jews, right? The next largest, after the 2 largest groups we're talking about, but Australian Jews, Argentinian Jews, they each area of the world structured differently. Some of them have elections like we're having. Some places it's far more an appointed thing from the larger organizations.
Yeah, we're under the rubric of the American Zionist movement, and they're under their own organizations.
And actually, if you're really curious on this, because I've had congregants ask me about like how secret is my ballot kept, right? Both the fact that I voted and who I voted for and who's in charge of this all, right? We live in a suspicious time, and I, very clearly voting is secret. It is why they outsource to another organization, right? They outsource the voting procedure itself. And if you look at the leadership of the American Zionist movement, you see a diverse leadership in terms of who sits in those roles, which speaks to it's not some secret group that's leading it. right? Easier than ever, thanks to the internet, right? You can now go and look at the names, and there are bios of the officers, and you see that they come from a variety of different backgrounds. I assume all of them are probably running on slates, actually. But some of them are running on slates. But it's a diverse group, again, trying to build confidence that we should be participating in this fair vote.
You. We have a couple of questions about the influence of the World Zionist Congress. So one from Dr. Friedman is, does the Zionist movement, and I'm not sure if he means the Zionist movement or the Zionist Congress, have influence over the Netanyahu government? Another one is, are we voting on anything that directly has to do with the war or current Israeli government? For example, Americans wanting to release the hostages versus ceasefire versus continue the war. Neil, I know you spoke about the World Zionist Congress making decisions around some of the policies of the WZO and Jaffe. What are some of those policies? What are we voting for in this election?
So let me first get to Bob's question directly. The answer in the classic style that he's taught me is yes and no. The truth of the matter is all money is fungible. So anything they fund, the Israeli government doesn't have to fund. Now, the Israeli government right now cannot meet its social service needs. There's just no way with a war on multiple fronts going on. And of course, that has increased needs. So part of what this money goes to is the Jewish Agency for Israel. In part, it goes to resettling new refugees or new immigrants, I should say. How you define how long that person is an immigrant or a refugee is an interesting question, but they will need significant social services. So there is direct money that goes to the Jewish Agency for Israel. There is a whole mechanism within Jaffe, the Jewish Agency for Israel itself, in terms of funding it. But it all goes to social service needs. None of it goes to the best of my knowledge, certainly not lethal military needs, certainly not non-lethal maybe some non-lethal military needs, such as medical kits, but I doubt even that. And the real issue is how much money, remember, it's how much money we raise that we give to the Jewish Agency for Israel through the World Zionist Organization, of which the World Zionist Congress elects delegates to decide that matters. So if we get more money, we will have more influence. The Netanyahu government, because of the makeup of the Knesset, does have some pressure in terms of where that could go, but it's not direct pressure. Let's put it that way. This is where we will have influence, particularly on something that we haven't talked about, which is religious pluralism funding. There is funding for religious streams, more so from this money than what the Israeli government on a percentage basis itself will give to streams. Rabbi, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah, well, I'll work backwards since you went there, right? Which is, let's remember that separation of church and state is an American kind of concept. It has not existed in Israel the same way, right? And so state funding of rabbi salaries of religious institutions, the granting of land to build synagogues on, even land ownership is generally different in Israel. Most Israelis, even if you've been to a friend's house in Israel, they probably don't actually own the land on which their house is sitting. I am not from Baltimore originally. You Baltimoreans may understand this better than anywhere else I've lived in terms of how some of our houses and their lands interact with each other, right? But there is a real debate amongst many of these slates in terms of which Jewish expressions should be given voice or funding more than others, or equally, versus maybe approached differently. I would say that what's so important in this is not just what happens at the World Zionist Congress when it comes together policy-wise, but who gets appointed to positions of authority in the various national institutions and subcommittees, and how some of that money gets spent. Does it directly influence the Netanyahu government or any government, right, in the history of Israel? I think Neil's right? Funding is fungible to some extent, but if we're talking about $1 billion versus 135 billion, right, that's fractional there. There are questions in terms of, as we talk about who owns land in Israel, where funds might get spent within the 67 borders or beyond the 67 borders. Some of that debate is even hotter now than it would have been at any given point since the 90s, right? And so those are definitely some of the issues that are dealt with. And I would just point out, this is a coalition system. No one slate is going to win the majority of seats. Just like in Israel, no one party has ever won the majority of the seats. The Labor Party's largest number was not 61 at its height, right? In terms of when it used to dominate. And so by definition, you're talking about coalitions of interest and organizations together.
I want to just add to that. This is really not about the diaspora forcing its vision, whether it's about religious pluralism or anything else in Israel. For those things to happen in Israel, you have to have Israeli partners, and they have to do their job. There is natural inherent tension there, and that is not a bad thing. I've always believed that tension amongst people who are looking to do good things will create good things. And I believe this process is part of that.
Kate, part of that question was about directly on the war as well. I think that's sort of, I hate to say something so important is simply part of Neil's and my general answer, but I think that is the case, right? It's part of Neil's and my general answer. The World Zionist Congress does not make any Israeli policy, fiscal, education, health, defense, security. These are generally not funds that go in that direction in any way. It is a voice if anyone's listening, right? It is a voice in terms of just as we said, we're here to encourage people to vote. Well, if a lot of people vote, and a lot of people vote one way or another, or mixtures of ways, that's a message to the Israeli government in terms of the connection of American Jewry to Israel and the pulse on American Jewry's commitments and concerns in Israel.
So let me ask a quick question that one person raised. Are there any anti-Zionist parties on these slates that you're aware of?
They would have to agree to the Jerusalem program to do that. So if you're really asking, does the Torah Carta show up with their offensive signs? The answer is no.
But what I would raise two concerns that have floated around, like the talking about this, writing about this, gossiping about this. There are some slates whose backers once upon a time, as in 2 elections ago, would not have participated, would not have wanted to sign the Jerusalem platform, and have decided they're going to use their voice and decide they can support the Jerusalem platform. So you've got that going on. Not to throw in conspiracies, there are some concern that non-Jews who are very pro-Israel, right? Religiously right-wing Christians, if I can use the term, there is some concern, right? It's self-identify as Jewish, right? There's no identity check here, right? And there is some concern that I have never heard before of that we may have some non-Jews voting, and by that I don't mean non-Jews who maybe have raised Jewish kids and are fully part of a Jewish community, but non-Jews whose vision of the Messiah and the end of times leads them to identify as Jewish enough to be able to say they should vote in this. Again, it's just a rumor. I've seen no one actually do hard work on this, but
no, there is a question about election interference that someone raised about, because it is, if you pay your $5, you can vote, and theoretically, is there even a check that, like, other than honesty in terms of voting more than once?
I think there is voting more than once from the same. You got to enter in
a different email address or something, but.
I voted so long ago. I mean, if you look, you could have 6 email addresses, but I think there was something beyond just my name. It might have been my email address, and I assume if you try to vote for the same email address, you may get hit. Neil, do you vote?
I haven't experienced that or heard about that yet, but what I will say is what I said a little earlier, is that I think we do need to relook at everything. We're in an era where people are suspicious of different type of electronic surveillance or monitoring, whatever you want to call it. about diaspora and Israel ties. There's nothing wrong with looking at all this when issues are raised. And I think between now and the next Congress, we will see some of that being addressed. But keep in mind, we're really new at navigating elections in a very different environment than even 5 years ago, and certainly than 10 years ago.
What I would also add to that is interesting is, I don't know about, I mean, again, that's why it's outsourced in terms of trying to deal with people who really run big things and don't just do it once every 5 years, right? So you're able to have a real technological reality and not a ramp up. But in some of the discussions that went on in the American Zionist movement over this past year, there was a proposition put forward that no voting could happen on Shabbat. It did not pass. You can vote 24/7, but there was a proposition of setting down, clearly coming to try to stop certain people from voting who might be more likely to vote on Shabbat, right? Out of the values of people who thought that that was inappropriate to vote on Shabbat, right? Let's give it all the best read on that possibility. And so that plays in different ways, right? I mean, again, I'm the rabbi of Baltimore Hebrew congregation. We are encouraging our congregants at their seders to vote and encourage voting, right? Like, because that is when people will be gathered in terms of that, right? So it's not tampering, but even in the process, there is efforts to push points of view. That's the nature of coalitions. We don't vote for slates in America, but we know in various rooms around the country, there are debates about policy that may or may not help someone's own interests.
I'll jump in. Matthew Weinstein, another member of our community, was also on one of the slates, asks about the shift in terms of just broader representation across the World Zionist Congress, in terms of, like, for a while, and you could fact check me on this, the kind of the center left coalition held the majority, but that seems to be shifting away
Sure.
in terms of the representation. Is that just because other parts are growing or becoming more active in the election, or how's that? What's the electoral shift been like?
Well, the answer to your first two questions is yes, it's reflective of the Jewish world. The Jewish world indeed has shifted in the last 10, 20 years. For sure, in Israel, it has. What happens in Israel does impact American Judaism. And some of the groups that the rabbi was talking about that were at best a-Zionists in earlier elections are now getting in, and they are a little more disciplined, and they're very focused, and they're getting more people to step up. Look, we've seen in Israel, if I went back in time 40 or 50 years and said to the typical American Jewish Zionist, the Labor Party is going to be down to 5 seats or 6 seats, they would say, "Oh, are you crazy?" Then you have these centrist groups that rise in Israel and America, which are really center right, which is, look, I'm a centrist, so I believe that center right to center left is great. But we, through this process, are clearly reflecting the world Jewish community, without question.
What I would only add to that is it reflects the general changes within the Jewish community. And part of those changes is it reflects a new activism upon some of those groups that Neil just referenced to, that not only may be larger than they once were within our percentages of American Jewry, but have pointedly decided to participate in a way. It really started in the last round, but in a way that they just had never participated before. So if you've got a whole swath of the community that didn't used to even pay attention to it or participate, suddenly participating, that's going to change the numbers in terms of what's going on.
Yeah, and I might add, I think that in many regards is fantastic, because it forces Jews of different flavors to interact with each other while agreeing to an overall goal. And ideally, it energizes the others as well, people who have long been involved in the process, such as myself, to encourage others to get involved as well. We're all winners in that regard, despite how some people might be a little rankled at first.
Questions we have is around why is organized Jewry so disinvolved in this critical process? I mean, so many people I've spoken to are not even aware the elections are happening.
I would
Why
take
has
that.
why has
Keep the rabbi,
turnout been
let's
so
jump in.
low, and how
So
can the people on this call encourage their friends, family, neighbors to
I'm
vote
gonna be
and
very
be
blunt.
involved?
Organized Jewry is a wreck, right? There's no national Jewish organization that has anywhere near the status it once had 30 or 40 years ago. A lot of that has to do with societal trends. You know, it's the bowling alone thing. It's the lack of collectivization over the individualization. I personally do not understand why synagogues and other groups don't say to people, it's a vote-a-thon on Sunday. Come and we'll pay for you to vote, right? It's $5.
You cannot do that, Neil.
You cannot do that. I did not
You
know that.
cannot pay for someone else's vote. I can give you all the pizza I want, but you cannot pay for someone else's vote.
Well, I'll take $5 worth. That's my response to that. But I think that organizations just don't see this as a priority right now, and synagogues, many synagogues, not all, and for understandable reasons. Look, we're going through a tremendous restructuring process in organized American Jewish life now. We have not figured it out. We're in a time where small, intimate, meaningful relationships is much more powerful than organizational relationships. And we're navigating that. I hate to use those crazy buzzwords, but organizational American Jewry as terms of national, multi-focus, multi-issue organizations is, to be polite, severely challenged right now. The focus groups, we see that. I mean, I'm going to do the impolitic thing. Look at FIDF. It comes out of nowhere in the last 10 or 15 years. Very focused, very focused. There's a limit to how far groups like that can go, but they're very good at what they're doing by staying on message. And they're, by the way, not running in this, so that's not a commercial at all.
So what I would say is, I mean, I'm amongst those Reform rabbis who have spent my whole career pushing this, well aware, just having come from a conference a couple of weeks ago from the Central Conference of American Rabbis, colleagues who were sort of unaware of the process and what's going on. If you go to the website of just about any national organization that's on a slate, you're going to see right now on their website, right? And like, I was honest on this, right? I was just, while Neil was talking, I went to the Orthodox Union's website. Pops up right away, right? Like it's a banner that pops up right away. I know that's true for the URJ. I assume anyone's voting's there, but there's so much noise in our internet and our email boxes and everything that's going on of how we get it across, right? I think it's crucial. What I would say is, because so many people are disengaged, here's the opportunity for any of us who care. And I'm going to predict that anyone who's on this call today, and likely anyone who watches the recording, is someone who maybe already was likely to vote or on the edge of voting, or I'd ask you to raise your hands, but we can't see you, but you can raise your hands anyway, who already voted, right? But if you care, then it's like any electioneering. We know how close American elections go. If you care and want to see people involved, well, then encourage them to vote, right? As I said, we're doing it at my Seder, right? We're not having vote-a-thons, but there's just about nothing you could come to at Baltimore Hebrew Congregation from March 10th, when the voting started, till May 4th, when it ends, where you wouldn't have a volunteer stepping in front of you encouraging you to vote. We can't control where people are voting. They're going to vote wherever. We want them to vote, even if we've got a specific thing. But what I would say is that's an invitation, right, to it. I would also say, Kate, that goes back to our early answer. This whole process is so Byzantine that it makes it harder to explain also. So, like, add that into all the context Neil talked about, and then we're trying to get people to do something that's downright confusing. This isn't like when I was a kid and I was being asked to buy a tree around Tu B'Shvat, right? Like, that was a very crystal clear message.
Very focused.
This is not just study more Talmud or daven more. This is participate in something that we're going to have to spend some time explaining. Because what do you mean I have a vote on something that impacts Israel? It's confusing on that front.
I think we've just about come to the end of our time, and that seems like a good place to end. Thank you both so much for taking the time to be with us today. As Rabbi Busch mentioned, this is being recorded. I will send out the link to everyone who is registered. If your friends, family, community have questions about the elections, passing this recording along to them would be a great place to start to encourage
Can
them
I have
to
a last
vote.
word?
Of course. Go for
And
it, Neil.
certainly let the rabbi have one after that if he chooses to. You know, the rabbi correctly pointed out that $1 billion is not a lot in the big picture of the Israeli budget, but $1 billion is a lot of money to Israeli social services. $1 billion is a lot of money for people who are trying to religiously express themselves in Israel in any way that they see fit. And I think our challenge now for everyone on this call and hopefully for others who hear it and see it is to get a couple other people to vote. I've been voting for a long time, and truth in advertising, I finally got my wife to vote. We live in a time where our American Jewish community, not for necessarily good reasons, is focused on Israel and Jewish peoplehood. And this is a great expression of that. And like I said, if we all come together and all are arguing about this one thing about how to make Israel better, ultimately we're all going to win. So I'm really grateful to the council for doing this and for enabling me to participate. So thank you.
I mean, all I would add to that, and Neil sort of hit it, though my wife has been voting for years already, Neil. In terms of this, but what I would say in terms of this is, sometimes what paralyzes people in any election, I don't care whether it's their high school student council or American elections or this elections, is a feeling like my vote is just one vote of many. What kind of influence do I have? We've all watched American coverage enough to understand how that does make a difference in many elections, and hand in hand, you know, my vote isn't going to have influence, right? Because of what goes on, right? Votes translate to influence, even if influence is imperfect. But if we think about our influence in our families or with our friends or probably within our organizations, that is imperfect. It's about relationships and coalitions and having our voice that matters. And this is one that really matters within our Jewish community to know we cared enough to participate, right? And I think to Israel and the world to knowing that it is a real voice that we care in a way that you get to color how you want to color, right? Because you get to choose the slate that you're voting for, and those numbers do become public in the end in terms of what happens and where the vote went. Thank you for hosting this, Howard, Kate, and the BJC.
Thank you so much for being with us today, and thank you to all who have joined, and happy Passover when it comes.